There is a press briefing transcript in the C-SPAN archive, dated September 10, 2001, that most Americans have never read. It is publicly available. It has been there since the morning it was recorded. The room was the Pentagon. The speaker was Donald Rumsfeld, Secretary of Defense of the United States. The transcript runs to several pages. On page 4, Rumsfeld says this: "Our financial systems are decades old. According to some estimates, we cannot track $2.3 trillion in transactions. $2.3 trillion, not billion. Trillion," announced publicly in a press conference by the sitting Secretary of Defense on September 10, 2001, the next morning at 9:37 a.m. Eastern Time. A Boeing 757 struck the western face of the Pentagon. 189 people died. The world changed in a morning. And the $2.3 trillion, the announcement, the question, the press conference transcript, disappeared into the noise of a century. It did not go into the congressional record in any substantive way. It did not produce hearings. The reporters who had been in that room were, by the following afternoon, asking different questions entirely. I want to be precise about what I am not saying. I am not saying the timing was engineered. I am saying the timing was a fact, and that the question Rumsfeld raised did not get answered. What I found, 16 years later, is that the number he announced in that room was not the ceiling. It was the floor. If $2.3 trillion was announced missing on September 10, what happened to that question? Section 2. The numbers that don't add up in 2017. Dr. Mark Skidmore, a professor of economics at Michigan State University, was preparing a lecture. He had been listening to a recorded interview with Catherine Austin Fitts, a former Assistant Secretary of Housing and Urban Development under President George H.W. Bush. Fitts had made a claim Skidmore assumed was a misquote. She said the Office of Inspector General for the Department of Defense could not account for $6.5 trillion in military spending for a single fiscal year. Skidmore assumed she had meant $6.5 billion. He assigned his graduate students to look it up. He told them to check the government's own websites. The Office of Inspector General's published reports, the Department of Defense's own financial documents, and confirmed that Fitts had misspoken. They came back with the number. It was not $6.5 billion. The OIG report for fiscal year 2015 showed $6.5 trillion in what the government calls unsupported accounting adjustments, entries made to force financial statements to balance, with no underlying transaction records to support them. The Army's total approved budget for that same fiscal year was $122 billion. The undocumented adjustments were 54 times the size of the budget they were supposed to document. Skidmore and his students kept going. They pulled OIG reports year by year, going back to 1998. The figures they found, drawn entirely from government documents: 1998, $1.7 trillion in unsupported adjustments; 1999, $2.3 trillion; $2000, $1.1 trillion; $2007, $1.1 trillion; $2010, $875 billion; 2012, $1.7 trillion; 2015, $6.5 trillion. Total, across 17 years, across the Department of Defense and the Department of Housing and Urban Development, $21 trillion. At the time Skidmore published his findings, the entire United States gross national product, everything produced by every American worker, every company, every sector of the economy, in a full year, was $18.8 trillion. The undocumented adjustments were larger than the American economy. Skidmore published his findings in 2017. He wrote about them in Forbes. He filed formal inquiries. He contacted the Congressional Budget Office. He contacted the Government Accountability Office. Both told him, in substance, that if there were a significant problem, hearings would have already been held. Then the documents disappeared. What happened to the people who built those OIG reports, and where did the documents go? Section 3. The last known moment the Office of Inspector General reports that Skidmore's team used were, at the time of his research, publicly accessible on the OIG's own government website. His team downloaded and preserved copies before publishing. Shortly after Skidmore's findings became public in 2017, the OIG disabled the links to the key source documents. The reports were removed from public access. The specific date of removal is not recorded in any public announcement. There was no press release. There was no statement from the OIG explaining what had been taken down or why. The documents were there. Then they were not. The only reason Skidmore's research could be verified at all was because his graduate students had already saved local copies of what they found. What the official record shows and then stops showing is this. In fiscal year 2015, someone inside the Army's financial system entered a single journal voucher adjusting Army accounts by $6.5 trillion. The OIG noted in their own report that the voucher was unsupported, meaning there was no documentation, no transaction record, no underlying data to explain why $6.5 trillion had been moved. The OIG flagged it, published it, and the document was eventually made inaccessible. The last clearly documented public moment of those records being accessible was in early 2017, before Skidmore's work attracted attention. By the time journalists attempted to verify the documents independently, several of the primary source links returned error pages. Skidmore did the one thing that remained available to him. He contacted the Office of Inspector General directly to ask about the reports. Section 4. The witness Mark Skidmore is not an activist. He is not a journalist. He is a professor of economics specializing in public finance and state taxation, on faculty at Michigan State University since 1997. His published work before 2017 covered tax policy, local government finance, and state budget structures. He had no prior history of writing about defense spending or government accountability. When he contacted the Office of Inspector General, he was told he could not speak to any person who had worked on the reports in question. No name, no contact, no explanation beyond the refusal. He filed inquiries with the Congressional Budget Office. He was told, again in substance, that Congress had oversight mechanisms and that if a problem of this scale existed, it would have surfaced already. He filed with the Government Accountability Office. The same answer. Skidmore wrote in Forbes in December 2017, "The data I've found suggests that the federal government has engaged in illegal and potentially criminal activity for decades. If even half of these adjustments are legitimate, the implication is that the government is spending money on programs that haven't been authorized by Congress." That article is still available. No congressional hearing followed. No federal investigation was announced. No official body contacted Skidmore to dispute his numbers or provide an explanation for the adjustments he documented. The Congressional Budget Office's position, as of the time of his inquiry, was that no significant problem existed because no hearing had been called. The logic was circular. If it were serious, someone would have investigated. No one investigated, therefore it was not serious. Catherine Austin Fitts, the former HUD official whose statement had started Skidmore's research, was more specific about what she believed the adjustments represented. She had left government in the early 1990s and had since operated a financial advisory firm. Her position, stated publicly in multiple recorded interviews, was that the missing figures pointed to financing structures operating outside any congressional authorization, what she called a black budget economy. She named no specific programs. She provided no documentation for what the money was used for. Her documented role was specific. She had been the person who first publicly identified the $6.5 trillion Army figure, and she had been the reason Skidmore checked. In November 2018, the Department of Defense announced it had completed its first-ever independent audit. Not the answer Skidmore was looking for, a different kind of answer. Section 5. The anomaly. The audit mobilized 1,200 auditors. It examined the full Department of Defense. On November 15, 2018, the results were released. The Department of Defense had failed its first independent audit in its history. Deputy Secretary of Defense Patrick Shanahan, asked by reporters about the failure, said, "We failed the audit, but we never expected to pass it." A reporter followed up, "If the department cannot account for its own assets, why should taxpayers continue to fund it at current levels?" Shanahan replied, "We count ships right." The auditors had found 478 buildings and structures that the Department of Defense had listed as assets but could not physically locate. 39 Black Hawk helicopters appeared on ledgers, but were not present at any of the locations the ledgers specified. The department has now failed 7 consecutive independent audits. The most recent data available shows that, as of 2021 and 2022, auditors generated approximately 2,000 separate notices of findings and recommendations, formal flags on accounting problems, across a single audit cycle. Now consider what happened on October 4, 2018, 6 weeks before that audit result was announced. That was the day the federal government adopted Statement 56 of the Federal Accounting Standards Advisory Board. FASAB 56 is a modification to federal accounting rules. It permits federal agencies to modify, adjust, or omit information from financial statements when disclosure would, in the judgment of agency leadership, endanger national security. The modification applies not only to classified programs, it applies to all agencies. It applies to line items that may have no visible connection to national security programs. It permits entries to be deleted. It permits figures to be shifted between categories without disclosure. It permits financial statements to be submitted to oversight bodies that do not reflect the underlying financial activity. October 4, 2018, Brett Kavanaugh's Supreme Court confirmation was generating its largest news cycle. National Taco Day was a trending topic. A production announcement for Avengers 4 circulated widely. FASAB Statement 56 appeared in no major news coverage. The accounting rule that made undisclosed modification of federal financial statements legal was signed 6 weeks before the Department of Defense announced, publicly, that it had failed its first audit and never expected to pass. The audit happened. What it found was 478 missing buildings, 39 missing helicopters, and a legal framework already signed. That made the next audit's omissions permissible by law. Section 6. The SCALED record the 1996 Chief Financial Officers Act required all federal departments to conduct annual independent audits. 25 years passed. The Department of Defense was the only department that did not comply for the entire period. Senator Chuck Grassley addressed this from the Senate floor. His words are in the congressional record. He called the Pentagon's resistance to auditing 26 years of hardcore foot-dragging. The OIG reports that formed the basis of Skidmore's research, the documents that showed $21 trillion in unsupported adjustments across 17 years, are no longer fully accessible through official government channels in the form they were accessed in 2017. Some reports have been replaced with revised versions. Some source links return error pages. The original documents exist in the copies preserved by Skidmore's research team and in archived captures held by independent organizations, including Project Censored. No government official has publicly explained what the $21 trillion in adjustments represent. The OIG's own language, in the reports that remain accessible, describes them as unsupported, the government's own auditor's word for entries with no documentation. FASAB Statement 56, now in effect, means that future financial statements may legally omit line items that agency leadership designates as national security sensitive. There is no public registry of what has been omitted. There is no mechanism by which Congress receives notice of what categories of spending have been reclassified or removed from standard financial reporting. Catherine Austin Fitts, writing to journalist Matt Taibbi of Rolling Stone, described FASAB 56 in these terms. The U.S. government just officially changed its governance model from a constitutional republic to fascism through an obscure accounting policy. That characterization is hers. What is documented without characterization is this. The Constitution of the United States requires that all federal expenditures be authorized by Congress. FASAB 56 permits agencies to submit financial statements to Congress that do not disclose all federal expenditures. Those two facts exist simultaneously in the current legal framework of the United States government. The $2.3 trillion Rumsfeld announced in September 2001 was never answered. It was not answered in the years following. It was not answered by the 2018 audit. In October 2018, the federal government adopted a rule that made answering it, in any public forum, optional. Section 7. The human cost. The 1996 law that required annual audits was not written by economists. It was written because Congress, in theory, authorizes every dollar the federal government spends on behalf of the American public. Soldiers are recruited on that authorization. Infrastructure is built on it. Veterans' benefits are paid from it. The terms of the social contract that Americans enter when they pay taxes and when they serve are defined by it. When an agency submits a financial statement with $6.5 trillion in unsupported adjustments for a single fiscal year, the people most directly affected are not economists or professors or journalists. They are the soldiers whose units submitted budget requests that were denied for lack of funds, while 54 times their annual budget moved through the same accounting system in undocumented entries. They are the veterans whose benefit claims stall in administrative backlogs at departments that report funding shortfalls. They are the residents of cities where HUD-administered housing funds were committed and not delivered. The audit trail for HUD's unsupported adjustments running alongside the Pentagon's in Skidmore's research. No congressional hearing has convened specifically to examine the $21 trillion figure. No criminal referral has been made based on Skidmore's research. No public official has been asked, under oath, to explain a single one of the journal vouchers the OIG flagged. Mark Skidmore returned to teaching public finance at Michigan State University. His Forbes article remains online. His research remains publicly available. The OIG reports he used in the form he used them are no longer all accessible through official channels. Section 8. The closing here is what physically exists today. The C-SPAN archive holds the full video of Donald Rumsfeld's September 10, 2001 press conference. The transcript is readable. The sentence is in it. The Forbes article by Mark Skidmore, published December 2017, is accessible online. His methodology is documented. His source citations are listed. Copies of the original OIG reports, including the FY 2015 Army report showing $6.5 trillion in unsupported adjustments, are held by independent researchers and archived by Project Censored. FASAB Statement 56 is a public document. It is available on the Federal Accounting Standards Advisory Board's official website. Its effective date is October 4, 2018. Its provisions are not classified. Here is what is not in the public record. There is no public explanation from any official source for what the $21 trillion in unsupported adjustments represents. There is no public accounting of where those entries originated, who authorized them, or what underlying activity, if any, they were intended to document. There is no named individual who has been asked to answer for them in any formal proceeding. The Department of Defense has failed 7 consecutive independent audits. After each failure, it has been funded at levels equal to or greater than the year before. And on October 4, 2018, while 3 other stories occupied the national attention, the federal government signed a rule that made it legal for any agency, in any future financial statement, to leave out whatever it chooses to leave out. The press conference transcript from September 10, 2001 is still in the archive. The question Rumsfeld raised that morning, where $2.3 trillion went, was never answered. 16 years later, a professor at Michigan State found that the number had grown by the government's own documents to $21 trillion. Then the documents were taken down. Then the audit was failed. Then the accounting laws were changed. The archive is open. The transcripts are readable. The law is published. The money has no explanation that any public official has ever been required to give.